one of the most uh, brilliant minds that I've had the pleasure of engaging with in recent years, Dr. Vanessa E. Thompson. Such a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for the invitation, Jaamil. I really need to say I'm so humbled and so grateful to be part of this program, of this whole project, which is such a life-giving present.
Mm.
I'm really, really grateful to be here and to just also listen to Mayfield and the power of breathing in these times of death and necropolitics is really, it really touches my heart deeply. Your work always does, especially in this moment. So I'm very grateful. I'm happy to be here, especially also in this kind of transnational space and to follow up with kind of experiments of life.
Mm-hmm. Yes, experiments of life, cross cross continental, cross
Yeah.
cross spiritual, cross so many planes are being crossed, and yeah, and so I know you have some lovely words to share, and maybe some not so lovely words and realities to share as a part of your talk on breathing and the possibility of abolition. So I'm gonna turn it over to you, and yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, as Mayfield Brooks was actually journeying with us through breathing, I will invite you to think about breathing more in terms of what is currently happening, but also when we think of the Haitian Revolution, of what is not so new. So as we currently see global protests for Black lives sparking the streets, not only in the US, but also in Europe, various countries on the African continent, Latin America, so really globally, and in the midst of a pandemic, and on the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition, that is the continuity of the Haitian Revolution, a systematic revision of understandings of policing and security, which not only fail to account, but rather render impossible Black life, seems to be long overdue. So this is actually an invitation for a brief revision of these understandings of security that shape our lives. So in my input today, I would like to talk about the various modalities of policing Black and racialized lives. And I will depart from a Black abolitionist feminist framework. I will draw on current debates and accounts on policing in European context, especially with regard to Blackness. And I will also draw on a collaborative research project with anti-racist social movements in continental Europe. And coming from these ventures, I will discuss the coloniality of modern policing as the condition of unbreathing. Finally, I delve into some of the archives and registers of police abolition as a necessary precondition for a world in which we can all breathe, and a continuation of the abolition of enslavement. So we must turn to the lived experiences of the policing of Black and racialized, poor, migrant, and gendered lives, as they prove to ground a radical critique of policing and new forms of living that actually account for life as precious. Lived experiences of racial profiling, for instance, entail being criminalized, being humiliated in the public as well as in the private, being addressed with racist language, as well as psychological and/or physical violence and death. The documentations and reports of anti-racist organizations and people of color collectives describe the various consequences of policing, and they have done since decades. The appropriation of the racialized body via the police as a continuation of a property relation entails a severe restriction of the freedom of movement of Black and racialized subjects. As such, racial profiling, for instance, can be described with Sarah Ahmed as a stopping device, a device of indefinite detention through which the existence and freedom of movement of racialized bodies is not only denied, rather our bodies become borders themselves. And this practice of bordering through police interpellation also reproduces societal racism and anti-Blackness, as it replicates the hegemonic representation of police stopping and searching the right ones, and confirms hegemonic subjectivities in their desire for safety and security and as legal subjects. A relation which is based on the oppression and exploitation of policed and incarcerated subjects. Moreover, police subjects have to do the labor of decriminalization, often by themselves, after the control took place. Policing takes time, as George Lipsitz writes. Now, this means that racial profiling does not end with the end of the actual control. Rather, racial profiling extends the actual control in time, in space, and in embodiment. Many initiatives against racial profiling in Europe have been documenting how police subjects face stress from policing, from the physical and psychological violence it enacts, depression, fear of persecution, and panic attacks can develop. Further, there are no independent report offices in continental European context. Moreover, and this points to the effects of societal racism, witnesses rarely speak on behalf of the victims of racial profiling. Lawyers are also difficult to find, as it is known that legal procedure against the police is rather hard to obtain. And like this, the criminalization of Black people and of racialized folks is reproduced as they are further constructed as perpetrators, never as victims of police violence who deserve care and protection. A current case from Switzerland demonstrates this. Wilson A., who was stopped and searched by the police on October 10th in 2009 in a tram after he came from a meeting with a friend and asked why the police only checks on him and his friends, explained that he was aggressively pushed out of the tram and then brutally beaten. Wilson A. explained that he told the police that he just had heart surgery, but the police continued and even insulted him with racist slurs. As stated in the many reports of support groups and his own testimony, Wilson A. could barely breathe. Breathing refers to the physical as well as to social breathing here. And I approach these experiences through a Fanonian framework and follow, among many other, especially Black radical scholars, the crucial and material motive of unbreathing, a motive which sticks to the policing of race, especially of Blackness, through time and space. The metaphor and materiality of unbreathing haunts Black subjects through registers of violence enacted by policing. Frantz Fanon once wrote that the colonial condition is characterized by combat breathing, breathing as in a constant situation of war. He also stated that people do not revolt because of a particular culture, but because they simply can no longer breathe. The politics of breathing or unbreathability run through the lived archives of Black and racialized people historically. Breathing as a relation enables to be part of, in and with the world. It enables exchanging with the world. Policing renders this impossible. Now, the reference to George Floyd's last word is striking. But also think of Eric Garner, who died in a police chokehold on July 7th, 2014 in New York. His last words were, "I can't breathe." Think of the killing by police of Samuel Dolphin in Finland in 2018 and of his friend who stated he was shouting and calling my name, "Ofori, Ofori, they are killing me, I can't breathe." Think of Adama Traore, who died in police custody in July 19th, 2016 in Paris. His last words were, "I can't breathe." and William Tonum Bobda, who was brutally held underground and violated by security personnel on the morning of April 2001 in 2019 in front of the University Hospital Hamburg-Eppendorf, and died 5 days later. He had initially come voluntarily to the psychiatric department to seek psychological advice. His case was just closed this month. Policing as unbreathing, however, is not always explicitly expressed in these words. I'm thinking of the breath of fear of Christi Schwundeck, who was shot in a job center in Frankfurt am Main on May 19th in 2011, and Dey Mariam Sarr, who was killed in July 2001 on July 14th in the house of her white ex-partner. In both cases, 2 or more police officers, as well as 1 more person, were present, and Christi Schwundeck and Dey Mariam Sarr were the only Black women in these respective situations. The Black refugee activist Sister Mimi, who was engaged in the refugee protests at the Oranienplatz and the Gerhard Hauptmann School in Berlin, died on December 11, 2014. She continuously argued that the repression by police absorbs her breath. Combat breathing, or better, unbreathing, as in a constant state of war. Think of the policing of Black bodies in the Black Mediterranean, an archive and perspective that speaks to the genocidal relation between Europe and the African continent since centuries, since enslavement, and which allows to put what is often called a refugee crisis in historical perspective in terms of the killing of Black and racialized bodies. But the emergency was for the baby that was not breathing. They took her on the big ship and tried to reanimate her, but there was nothing to do, explained Hope, a mother of 3 children who lost 2 of her children while crossing the deadly waters of the Mediterranean Sea. Drowning is defined as respiratory impairment, a specific form of asphyxia as a result of being in and under liquid. The motive of unbreathing or combat breathing sticks to Black and racialized experiences with criminalization, policing, and death. And it travels from the transnational to the translocal, from the prison cell to the psychiatry and the lager, to the urban or domestic space, from the land to the shores and the sea. Racial profiling in its everyday forms also speaks to forms of unbreathing, albeit not in lethal forms, being stopped, rushing to breathe during a check, getting out of breath when running away from the police, like Ziad Benna and Bouna Traoré in France. Or when being surrounded and brutalized by police, such as the 15-year-old teenager from Hamburg who was stopped, brutalized, and held on the ground by 8 police officers where he could barely breathe. The condition of unbreathing shows that we are interpolated by police differently. Some of us are affirmed in their legal status and their understanding of safety and security. Others, or othered, are oppressed exactly on the basis of this status and would rather run away from police as constant fugitives. Wilson R. filed charges. The police officers filed charges too. And after 9 years, the 3 police officers were acquitted. The psychological, physical, and financial constraints that come with such a process are part of the violence of and through policing. Black and other racialized subjects are not perceived as victims in the hegemonic economies of perception, even if we were the ones who called the police. The case of Derge Wevelsieb from Frankfurt am Main demonstrates this. After a racist ticket control in a metro, he, in October 2012, called the police and was then beaten by the police. He called for support in front of his wife and 3-year-old son. Usman Sey, who died in a police cell in Dortmund on July 2012, called the ambulance, and instead of receiving medical care, he was arrested and died in police custody. The slow violence of racist intersectional policing also works through the ways in which family members and friends of police victims are treated by the authorities and state institutions. Closing of procedures, or procedures that extend over years, racism during hearings, as in the case of the NSU complex, where the families of the victims killed by the so-called National Socialist Underground were accused of being involved in the killings, or just silence. Family members and friends thus experienced a continuation of systematic violence and forms of unbreathing, which not only extend the actual control or murderous incident, but also the subject it was directed towards. Racist intersectional policing is both trans-temporal and transgenerational. The sudden death of Uri Jallou's mother, Mariamba Jambo Diallo, after she came to Germany a second time during the trial, is part of this form of slow violence. Uri Jallow was murdered in a German police holding cell in Dessau in January 2005. In the US context, one can think of Erica Garner, Eric Garner's daughter, who, after her father was killed, became even more engaged in the struggles for Black lives. She died with 27 because of a heart attack related to her asthma disease. That Eric Garner couldn't breathe, the condition of unbreathing was already scripted symbolically before her death as she carried the last words of her father, "I can't breathe," into the protest on multiple levels. And these accounts demonstrate that the policing of Blackness and of racialized folks as the condition of related forms of unbreathing is deeply intersectional. Black people who live at the intersections of oppressions are particularly vulnerable to murderous policing. Black, especially dark-skinned Black women, queer, and especially trans and non-binary people, Black people with disabilities and mental vulnerabilities, working class and poor people, Black people rendered refugees and asylum seekers, illegalized sex workers. The cases of Christy Schwundeck and De Mariam Sa, as well as others, demonstrate that an intersectional perspective on racist policing is necessary to not only analyze the ways in which police violence draws on intersecting modes of oppression, but further to account for the specific forms of policing and their spaces that multi-marginalized gendered subjects and groups are exposed to. Accounts of support groups and initiatives show that Black women, women of color, queers, and non-binary folks are criminalized as sex workers and are exposed to identity checks and searches. Black women, women of color, queers, and non-binary folks who work in the sex industry are particularly vulnerable to racist policing and its gendered implications. A higher frequency of controls can have severe impacts on their lives, also in terms of, for instance, child custody regulations. More controls and police raids, moreover, further render vulnerable sex workers who are illegalized. Black and racialized mothers in general are often constructed as bad mothers and over-policed. This is also important with regard to the cases of Christy Schwundeck and De Mariam Sa, as their children were implicitly or explicitly involved in both cases. In the cases of Schwundeck, she was struggling to get her child out of foster care, which also fed into her depression. And Mariam De Sa wanted to pick up her son from her ex-partner, but he has hidden their son from her, and she actually wanted to pick him up. Our critiques of policing thus must interrogate the interdependency of systems of policing and punishment, regimes of welfare and social services, foster care and their implicit orders. Active inaction, when Black and racialized subjects are in danger and or go missing, is also a modality of policing. This modality shows that racialized subjects, multi-marginalized subjects in particular, are not only constructed as perpetrators and violent offenders, but furthermore fall through the cracks of perceptions and regimes of security and safety. The active inaction by police in the case of the Black asylum seeker Rita Ovo-Oyunge demonstrates this. Oyunge was missing since April 2019. Her body parts were found in the forest near the Lager Hohenleipisch in Brandenburg on June 11, 2019. It took police more than 2 months until they found her remains in the nearby forest. The friends and her family continuously pressed that she was missing. She had repeatedly reported sexual harassment in the camp before, and her son has repeatedly told his father and police that someone had violently beaten her before he brought her away from the camp. Not only was Rita Ovo Oyonga's son not believed, her reports on sexual harassment were further ignored, which points to the intersectional violence within the Laga system. She was further implicitly criminalized as a bad mother who would leave her children by themselves without letting anyone know. The mourning of their children by the families who lost their loved ones through the racist terrorist attack in Hanau 6 months ago this week is related to the inaction of police and state authorities. This is what slowing down breath as forms of premature death, the core of racism, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore teaches us, looks and feels like. Black initiatives and collectives of color have historically long, criticized and mobilized against forms of intersectional punishment and policing, also in Europe. They have challenged and still challenge the racist status quo and reveal that an institution which was constituted at the heart of capitalist modernity and an alleged protection of democracy produces the near-political gendered condition of unbreathing. Documentation plays a crucial role in this in order to make a societal invisible practice visible. Besides documentation, various initiatives support victims of racialized profiling by creating spaces in which police subjects can share their experiences and seek all kinds of support and of healing. The sensitization of dominant society is part of these programs in forms of research, reports, video campaigns, workshops, alternative media, and creative interventions. And fugitive forms of memory making, putting their names on the streets, on street signs, graffitis, and other forms of art. The claims of the organizations and initiatives span from the abolition of preventive policing methods to the inclusion of racial policing and anti-discrimination law. Moreover, the establishment of independent report and documentation offices is something that most of the groups are calling for. But there are also collectives and groups that draw on an understanding of safety that is neither grounded in nor based on violence. Abolitionist intersectional collectives, such as, for example, Sisters Uncut in the UK, Collectif Cas Rebelle in France, and Women in Exile in Germany, have done important and crucial work with regard to developing concepts that withdraw and divest from forms of state security and punishment, which always and already put our lives at risk. This is the continuity of the Haitian Revolution. Their fugitive practices, developing modes of abolitionist care and taking care of each other, practices of memory making and transformative justice, which operate at the outside of the modern proposed order of being, law, property, and security, have a lot to offer to global articulations of practices of life, of the matter of Black lives, and for a world in which we can all breathe. And in this moment, as Arundhati Roy reminds us, is a portal. It is necessary to not only learn, but to commit to the experiences and to the knowledges of those of us who were never allowed to breathe. Thank you.